Inflation has steadily cooled over the past 2 years, despite seeing a slight stall in October and November of 2024. Prices for items like gasoline, used cars, and energy have declined accordingly. But food prices continue to outpace inflation, increasing by 28% since 2019.
I just spent $33 on dinner tonight. I'm literally just making like lasagna soup.
What are you talking about? Was $8.25, now $6.89. Like this is some amazing deal.
For 4 chicken breasts, $10 to $11.
86% of consumers reported feeling frustrated with rising grocery prices.
That makes sense to me. I've definitely been noticing this trend through social media and other aspects of people are starting to complain a lot about, I think the primary ones being grocery prices and also rent. I do think those correlate to probably the two larger segments of expenses for the average household, which makes a lot of sense that if 75-80% of your budget for the month goes to like rent and groceries, and you're seeing those increase, that's where you're going to feel most of the pain instead of the remaining 15-20% or whatever is remaining for you as an individual. And so this definitely does seem to be something I'm noticing a lot of folks complain about, and curious to see what they'll say here about it.
And over a third said they have resorted to buying fewer items to save money.
That's one of the real gauges people have of their cost of living, because it's an important aspect of their cost of living. And it's something that we have a lot of exposure to. We go to the grocery store, we pick up the different products, we look at the prices.
So why are grocery prices still so high? And what can be done to bring the costs down? Like any other business, food processors, manufacturers, and retailers face various operating costs to get food from the farm to the grocery aisle. These costs play a key role in how products are priced. Just 15.9 cents for every dollar spent on food.
It seems like a very small percentage that they're highlighting here.
Goes to the farm that actually produced it.
Wow, so that goes to the farm. That's is a pretty small percent overall. And that's very curious. So this is where 84 cents on the dollar goes towards a lot of other segments of the supply chain for your food supply. They'll likely reference this, but obviously the farmers need to make the food, but then also that food needs to be transported. Maybe there is some processing on that food depending on the type of food that it is, and then actually put into stores where there's workers and rent that needs to go in for that grocery store, and then eventually you buy it. But it is very curious to see that actually only about 16% of what goes into paying for groceries that actually goes to the farms in this case.
There's so much more that goes into the cost of our food than just the actual food itself. There's a lot that goes into the producing it, moving it around, the transportation, the marketing, getting it on the shelves. It's not just the food. It's all of the inputs that go into it.
Unexpected global events set the stage for a sudden rise in food costs.
It was a global pandemic. There were disruptions all around the world in terms of production. At the same time that you just have this unexpected, unprecedented wave of demand, that is a recipe for it to really break down and you to go into the grocery store and see empty shelves, or go into the grocery store and see really higher prices.
Then in 2022, you had Russia invade Ukraine. That caused huge shocks to agricultural commodity prices, especially wheat. Well, this starts feeding back on itself, because what it does is it makes, let's say, animal food more expensive for cows, pigs, chickens, etc.
The surge in inflation added more pressure on food manufacturers and retailers.
All the costs that are incurred after the farm, it's all the processing costs, the energy costs, the wage costs, all these things contributed to much, much higher prices. And these all were rising from about mid-21 onward, and they continue to rise.
Really what you've had experienced since 2021 is sort of this massive, what we call cost pass-through that has occurred. The idea of cost pass-through is just, imagine I'm a manufacturer, I'm producing an item, and let's say it's a case of product, it costs me $10. I may turn around and sell that for, let's say, $18. Let's say my costs go up 20%. Now all of a sudden that means I'm paying $12 for, this product, or I'm incurring a $12 cost to make it. At minimum, I have to now charge $20, but likely I'm going to charge a little bit more than $20 because I have to protect what we call my gross margin rate. That goes to the wholesaler. Well, the wholesaler is now seeing a $2.50 increase. They not only have to raise their selling price by $2.50, but they may raise it by $2.75 to the grocery store. The grocery store now sees $2.75 of greater cost. So they may end up charging $3 more overall because everybody's trying to protect their margin as we.
Yeah, so I just wanted to go through it. They seem to have some great points here. So one is maybe your initial reaction is this is just price gouging. Why are they just keep increasing the cost here at every turn? And so one thing to note is that each of these phases are made up of a variety of processes, equipment, real estate, and people. And so the manufacturer is made out of a team and group of people who are trying to get their job done. And so they need to make sure that their employees are paid appropriately so that they can also go buy the groceries that they just helped put into the hands of a wholesaler and downstream all the way to a consumer. And so they need to make sure that their business keeps running. One of the things that they also mentioned was margin. So one of the key ways that businesses make money is obviously selling things at a higher price than what it costs them. That's what every single person did in this phase, the manufacturer, the wholesaler, the grocery store. And so every time you do that, there is going to be some difference there, and that is the margin, which is if you sell a good for $20 and it costs you $10, then you have $10 of margin. Another way of looking at it is not just the absolute amount, like the $10 itself, but you could also say about 50% of that is profitability. And so, or 50% margin on it. And that's why they're adding these little bit extras, is because as they mentioned at the manufacturer stage, if the price of the good increases by 20%, you're probably going to want to increase your price by 20% as well, so that everything else flows through similarly. So that way you keep your margins there. Because if you don't do that, then basically your margin is going to start slipping smaller and smaller and smaller. And then you might not be able to do things like pay raises, because when you get a pay raise, oftentimes it's percentage based, for instance. And so you need to be able to make sure that your business can run on percentages. Maybe your rent will increase by a certain percentage due to inflation, for instance. And so you want to maintain a particular margin in a percentage fashion, not just saying, I will always only charge $10 more. Because then what happens if your food that you're trying to sell is $90 and you're selling it for $100, that's only a 10% margin. And there's other things that could go wrong. Like maybe you need to throw out a certain amount of goods because they were damaged or they're not in a proper edible state for it to move on. And this is where percentages come into play and why each of these segments are doing this.
You move through the supply chain.
Operating costs for food manufacturers reached a peak during the fourth quarter of 2022, seeing a nearly 19% increase compared to 5 years prior. But while operating costs have come down significantly, most experts remain pessimistic about a sudden deflation in food prices.
Once the price goes up, it tends to stay up. The inflation may come back down, so you don't see the big price increases, but outside of widespread depression, we don't tend to see prices falling across the board.
The last time we saw actual decreases in grocery prices that were substantial was really late 2015, but primarily 2016. It's important to remember that year saw a very sharp drop in oil prices, and also commodity prices came down further. And so you really have sort of a unique set of circumstances that caused actual deflation in food prices in 2016. None of us are expecting that to occur in 2025.
There's some categories where we've seen prices come up and down. Eggs are a good example. Like they did come back down quite a bit after the big surge. So it's not to say that there aren't individual prices that will come down, but as a category, most goods and services, once that price goes up, it stays up. Because again, you think of a big input cost in a lot of places are things like wages or building costs, things that would be difficult to then reverse. You just don't keep increasing them at the same pace.
In recent years, there's been another popular theory behind the rising cost of groceries: price gouging.
The question is, have groceries gotten more expensive just because of inflation, that is, passing along higher prices, or is there more going on here?
We all need food to survive. No matter what the price is, what that has meant over the last couple of years is that retailers have been able to take advantage of this.
63% of Americans surveyed in 2024 blamed price increases on large corporations taking advantage of inflation. Corporate profits accounted for well over 40% of inflation between the end of 2019 and mid-2022. In comparison, corporate profit drove just 11% of price growth over the 40 years prior to the pandemic. A report from Groundwork Collaborative also revealed that some of the largest food corporations have openly discussed their ability to keep prices high, even as inflation cools down.
Yeah, so just to call back to some of their data that they had earlier on in the segment, they even highlighted how food pricing has been outpacing inflation. And so this is where price gouging would be a potential segment here, where it is suspicious that food pricing is continuing to outpace inflation, because if it was just a pass-through segment, again, going back into the percentages, if the initial manufacturer increases their prices by 20%, then arguably everything should be 20% generally equivalently throughout that pipeline all the way onto the consumer prices. But because they're outpacing inflation, it means somebody is asking for a little bit more than what they necessarily need. And that's where price gouging comes in. We've seen a number of companies do this. I've reviewed a few other segments of other companies who have done this. I think McDonald's, for instance, is one that did this, where they just kept going crazy with their prices because people were just kind of eating those costs. And they were just dealing with it until eventually people just completely started to pull back, and McDonald's started to see a loss in their revenue. And then they started to decrease prices again. And so that could be what grocery stores are doing right now, which is because people have become accustomed to inflation increasing their prices of their groceries, that they're saying to themselves, well, why don't we just increase it another % this month? People are used to the prices increasing. We can just get an extra 1% profit. What's that going to hurt? And then they do this month after month after month, and then that's where prices can really add up.
The other thing to remember in all of this that we've talked about many times is our grocery products pricing is very sticky. And so the pricing that we've taken and that we're in the midst of executing the additional price increase, that pricing will by and large sustain.
Our actions around pricing and productivity have stickiness to them. While they address margin gaps in the near term, they will drive margin enhancement when inflation stabilizes.
The grocery sector as a whole is deeply concentrated. They have very little competition. And so this is what some economists call tacit collusion, where, big companies sort of side-eye each other and listen to each other's earnings calls and think, hey, they're not lowering their prices, so we're not going to do that either. And that sort of facilitates this really sticky, high-price situation that we find ourselves in.
A 2023 report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture revealed a significant increase in market concentration within the food sector over the past 40 years. Between 2018 and 2020, just 2 seed companies controlled 72% of corn acres and 66% of soybean acres. And most metropolitan areas saw just 5 to 6 store chains accounting for most of the supermarket sales. But some economists remain skeptical about whether real price gouging is happening within the food sector.
We've not seen any evidence from the Service Annual Survey of unduly large gross margin rates, not only in grocery, but also what we call warehouse clubs and superstores. That's your Walmarts, your Targets, your Costco's.
Gross margin rate for some of the biggest US-centric grocery retailers have not seen enough gains to show price gouging. The same goes for food manufacturers that are more global in scale.
We have regulatory agencies to watch over this stuff for a reason, but I think there's plenty to explain what's gone on in the food price grocery store inflation based on underlying fundamentals in the market. You don't have to resort to arguments that, this is price gouging on the part of these companies.
To account for high costs, More families are dipping into their savings or relying on their credit cards, buy now, pay later programs, or even payday loans to pay for their groceries. 60.5% of adults reported paying for groceries with a credit card in 2023, but just about a third said they paid the charge in full, while 7.1% said they haven't even made their minimum payments.
It means that people are going to desperate lengths to buy something that is just essential.
In 2023, U.S. consumers spent an average of 11.2% of their disposable income on food, with an average family spending about $3,187 for food at home per year.
I can sit here and say that food expenditures are small relative to the income that most households make, but for poorer families, that's not the case. It is high.
In 2023, low-income households spent an average of 32.6% of their after-tax income on food, compared to just 8.1% for households earning the highest income.
If you're a low-income family, you have to spend on the essentials, right? There may not be much left after that. So as a result,
I just wanted to go back to that chart because that was a pretty interesting chart that they showed. So on the left side, basically this is showing after-tax income spent on food as a percentage. And so the left side that is highlighted is the lowest, 20% is what I'm assuming, since there's 5 categories here. And then the highest 20% is spending 8.1% compared to that 32.6% for the lowest. And so this is where folks who have less income are struggling the most, because obviously food is an essential need. And this is where people are starting to spend more and more of their paychecks on this, especially if you're on the lower end of the spectrum for income. And this does generally seem to be following a somewhat trend as you go up, but it does seem as though the lowest 20% is noticeably more impacted than even the second lowest income segment here, which seems to be slightly under 20%, maybe in the 18-ish range from here. So there's obviously a huge drop off between the bottom 20 and the bottom 40%. And so this is where certain people are going to be very negatively impacted by these changes. And to some extent, I think this is intended by certain agencies. So, for instance, the Fed, for instance, is currently looking at interest rates, and they keep mentioning that there's a dual mandate, if you've heard this phrase before. And the dual mandate is to reduce inflation so prices can stabilize and be relatively healthy for consumers and for the market. And then the opposite side is the job market. And so as you increase the interest rates, essentially what's going to happen is that jobs are going to be harder and harder to get because businesses need to spend more on loans that they have, and then they have less money to then spend elsewhere, so on and so forth, and maybe even same thing for rent, etc. So this basically just increases prices for folks as they're spending, and so it's a way to kind of siphon money out of the economy, and then that will eventually lead to people having less and less money in their pockets. And so we're in this state right now where inflation has been so high, but it hasn't fully cooled down yet. And so they're still trying to siphon out money. And this is something where obviously it's a pretty one-size-fits-all tool for inflation rates. And so this is where different income brackets could be impacted differently. And so some people are going to be hurting more than others in certain aspects. And food is one of those essential areas where it almost certainly is going to impact the lowest income individuals the most.
For households earning the highest income.
If you're a low-income family, you have to spend on the essentials, right? There may not be much left after that. So as a result, what that means is that when prices for essentials rise, when prices for groceries rise, that really hits low-income folks the hardest.
During the pandemic, there were some extra programs that were put in place to really help people kind of beef up those benefits during the pandemic, and those have expired, but they did give an example of how we can strengthen those kind of programs. So if we're really all fired up about how expensive food prices are and we're worried about people being left behind, we do have public policies that we can shore up to help people who really are getting hit hard by those higher prices.
Other policies could help prevent prices from rising too much, or help Americans better cope with higher prices.
Improving access to guest worker visas and making that program more efficient so that farmers can get more labor in order to make sure products can be supplied smoothly. Making sure that we have good, smooth transit of imported goods from Mexico, avocados that everybody loves as an example, into the United States and have border crossings flowing smoothly.
Wages keeping up is really important, and we should definitely put in more reforms and structure to make sure that wages do continue to rise, encourage unionization, encourage other forms of collective bargaining. And at the same time, we do need to address the underlying issue of profiteering in the retail industry. Your dollar only goes so far if someone at the top is making everything you buy more expensive.
In August 2024, the FTC and the Justice Department held a first public meeting on illegal price gouging in several industries, including food and agriculture. While over 40 states ban price gouging, there's no federal law preventing corporations from gouging prices.
And then, next year we have a big tax fight coming up, and raising the corporate tax rate, as unlikely as it might seem in this political environment, would actually be a real deterrent to these big companies to price gouge their consumers, because price gouging is a lot less fun if you have to ship a bunch of your earnings over to the IRS. And so there are policy tools that we can use to address this issue. And I think it's really critical that we start to look really expansively at the things that we can do to make food prices more affordable for everyday consumers.
But some experts question how far policies can really go to affect food prices.
There's no silver bullet in terms of bringing down food costs.
We've went through a brutal inflationary cycle for food. There's really nothing government policymakers could really do about this. This is not something unique to the United States. This has been felt around the world. And right now we just have to wait and see how things will play out as we move forward.
The uncertainties introduced by the current political climate also make it challenging to predict the future of grocery prices.
There's no doubt that tariffs will massively make things more expensive, especially food. There's a lot of food that we all like to eat that we don't grow in the United States. So any food that we import gets a lot more expensive when you add a tax on that. Same thing with mass deportations. I mean, we have workers in this country who really prop up our food system, who make sure that the things that we want on our tables get grown, get packaged, get driven across the country. And when you start to really harm that workforce and send them away, that harms our entire economy. So I think there's absolutely no doubt that things will get more expensive under some of the policies that we're seeing the Trump administration propose.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.